Hare Krishna. Prior to ISKCON being established in 1966 in New York City, there was no organization or entity that was promoting the mission of Lord Chaitanya, the mission of Krishna consciousness in the Western world. Indeed, even from an individual perspective, there was very little, if anything, happening in that regard. And that is why Srila Prabhupada's spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, requested him back in the 1920s when they first met that at some point, if he could preach in the Western world. It took some 40 years later before Srila Prabhupada was able to travel to the West, but he did that on the instruction of his spiritual master. So when he came and established ISKCON, very shortly after doing so, even before doing so, already in Srila Prabhupada's mind was, how will this continue on after he leaves? Because he was already, when he set sail from India, he was 70 years of age. And as he said himself many times, he could depart at any moment. So naturally he reflected on what his own spiritual master thought was the best way. And that's an interesting story, because traditionally in India, the way that Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj wanted his movement, known as the Gaudiya Vaisnavism, to continue, was a departure from what was the tradition. And the tradition was that the leadership and the authority of any organization like that would sit with one person, the spiritual head. So Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, he was very successful when he created his Gaudiya Math organization. And at the time of his departure, there were 64 branches all over India. So then he decided that after he departs, he wouldn't give it to one person as was the tradition, but he would create a governing board. And the simple logic of that is that if you give something just to one person and then something untoward happens to that person, there's some tragedy or they change direction in life or whatever the case may be, then the organization is in jeopardy and comes under threat for its very existence. So Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj considered better to set up a whole governing board like that. Now, what's very interesting about this was that when Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj left, because that isn't the tradition, and for his disciples, his followers, it wasn't something they were familiar with. They were familiar with the, as I say, with what the tradition was. They really struggled to implement this, and in essence, they didn't do so. And they reverted to type, if you like, and different spiritual leaders within the organization effectively just took charge of their own particular math or their own particular temple like that. And in effect, the Gaudiya Math, as a result of that, has continued, but hasn't been as successful as you would have thought it would have been, certainly in terms of the success that Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj left, having 64 branches all over India like that. So when Srila Prabhupada set up ISKCON, likewise, he was 70 years of age, 71 years of age when he did that. So he was already thinking about how ISKCON would continue after his departure. And as we know, there is one general understanding that, you know, if you create something and you're successful in life with something, its real success is how it continues on after you depart. So Srila Prabhupada simply followed the instruction of his own spiritual master, and he set up a governing board. He did that while he was still present. And it's interesting, after his departure, it has continued on for more than 50 years now. And the reason being is that his disciples, Srila Prabhupada's disciples, were predominantly Western personalities. And they, of course, didn't have the tradition of how spiritual movements run and function and having one spiritual head. You know, they didn't have that background or that history or that tradition. So ironically enough, they've been more successful in maintaining that model. And now we see with ISKCON, after 50 years or more of its, since it was established, it is still going strong. And Srila Prabhupada, it's understood, at the time of his departure, ISKCON had effectively 108 branches, 108 temples worldwide, but now it has somewhere in the region of 10 times that number, which really goes to show the successful model that Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj gave initially to Srila Prabhupada and that Srila Prabhupada continued with ISKCON. Hare Krishna.